I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Join me on a quest to find awe and wonder in all creation, human or wild, vast or small, spiritual encounters that move us beyond words. Our guest for this episode is Johannes Fritz. He's director of the Waldrappteam, a nature conservation project supported by 8 different organizations in 3 countries of the European Union. In 1997, researchers in Austria set loose 10 rare large migratory birds in the wild. They were launching an experiment with an endangered species called the northern bald ibis. 10 juvenile northern bald ibises had been hatched and raised in captivity, their parents having been successfully bred in zoos, and now this new generation was old enough to brave things on their own. This reintroduction, or rewilding, appeared to be going swimmingly well. Ibises don't swim, so let's say flyingly well, soaringly well. But then, in August of that year, all 10 of them simply dropped out of sight.
From one day to the next, the bald ibises disappeared. All of them were gone. And then, surprisingly, days, even weeks later, we got reports from Germany, then also in the Netherlands, in Poland. And this was really surprising.
That's Johannes Fritz, who back in 1997 was among those very puzzled Austrian biologists, who at first feared that perhaps an eagle or another predator had blood on their talons. But no, the ibises were alive. It's just that for some reason they had scattered in every direction. Fritz was still quite young in his profession, but his career was itself about to take flight. These northern bald ibises, birds of a feather, apparently don't always flock together, or in this case, migrate together. After having been raised by hand and set free, they had flown incredibly long distances in several divergent directions across Europe.
In the next year, we started again with a new generation, and the same happened. They again disappeared in August. It became clear to us this was not a predator. It was not by chance. These juvenile birds have the motivation to migrate, but they don't know where to go.
As is the case in many other animal species, migration for these northern bald ibises is learned behavior. They just can't do it by instinct. It has to be modeled for them.
Large-sized species like the bald ibis need social information to find the wintering site. And they lack this social information because the parents are kept in zoos.
We'll be hearing in just a moment from Johannes Fritz the reason for this captivity in zoos. Meanwhile, have you heard the term charismatic megafauna? It refers to larger, non-human life forms that we humans generally respond to with considerable enthusiasm. Pandas, elephants, penguins, and orcas. Not always small, but definitely cute animals that people just love. And so they get heaps of media attention. Northern bald ibises are not, by any stretch of the imagination, cute. From the neck down, this animal is a feathered creature, which is only to be expected with birds. It has a duck-sized body, though more on the slender side than plump, and black plumage that shimmers with iridescent colors in the sunlight. But calling them bald is not at all arbitrary. The head is covered with wrinkled pink or reddish skin. It's often splotchy, as if it had some disease or a pox. The crown of its head sports a crest of long black feathers standing upright like a mohawk and giving the impression of perpetual astonishment. These ibises have decurved beaks that are long, bright red, perfectly evolved for digging worms or larvae. They remind me, frankly, of those macabre masks that were once worn by doctors during Europe's epidemics of the Black Death or bubonic plague. Maybe you've seen drawings of these masks, weird get-ups with a long hooked beak and large eye holes. But the northern bald ibis's off-putting appearance belies the fact that it is, or historically has been, perfectly edible. We'll talk a little bit more about that with Johannes Fritz when he tells the story of their numerical decline. But back to the baffling situation that the Austrian conservation scientists were confronting in 1997, that bewildering attempt at rewilding. The freed ibises seemed to sense an inborn urge to migrate, but had no clue about the best direction. Had they been hatched and parented in the wild, they would have been coached along by their elders to a suitable wintering spot. So you see the fundamental problem here. Heading north for the winter is completely skiwampus.
I was a young scientist, and this was, for me, where it became interesting. It was not the beauty of the bird or the bird species per se, and it was actually a Hollywood movie which inspired us. It was this movie, Fly Away Home, the story of a young girl which flies with Canada geese.
That one's fluffy and that one's grumpy.
See, the problem with your birds is they're going to want to migrate south, and they need someone to show them how.
Suppose I built an aircraft and then taught Amy how to fly it.
It's a great idea. You know, birds follow me, I follow you. We all go south.
An incredible journey for anyone who's ever had a dream.
Dad, they're really flying with me.
And the courage to make it fly.
The family adventure film Fly Away Home was released in 1996. That was just 1 year before Fritz's team in Austria released its first batch of ibises. The movie is based on a real story about Canadian naturalist Bill Lishman working with geese. 11 years previously, in 1985, Lishman had come up with the idea of foster parenting or imprinting geese in order to coach them along on a proper migratory route. Imprinting occurs when the newly hatched chick becomes attached to the caregiver they first see. In Lishman's case, however, proof of concept by imprinting birds and then piloting an ultralight airplane to guide them in migration had nothing to do with saving a species. After all, Canada geese are far from endangered. Still, his work became a model for later use by other people with other species, people like Johannes Fritz. The strategy is not without its critics, who see this direct intervention as unnatural. But Lishman's thinking was, well, if you want to rewild a migratory species, maybe you can do it with just a few generations to kickstart things, to remind them how it's done. The measure of success is whether subsequent generations, having been shown the proper route for migration, can then pass this knowledge and behavior along to their young. It took 3 years for Lishman to imprint a batch of goslings successfully, so that they would follow him when he took flight in his ultralight aircraft. By 1988, the trick was working, and his well-known story is documented in his memoir, Father Goose, on which the movie Fly Away Home is based. The procedure later proved workable not just for migratory geese, but for other species. In fact, Lishman used it to help whooping cranes that were in need of a new migration pattern. For 15 years, the cranes were helped in this way. Now, scientists in a quandary don't usually turn to Hollywood for answers. But in this case, a feel-good movie based on a true story was just the spark that Johannes Fritz and his colleagues needed. They got to work personally preparing these baby bald ibises for migration. The German word for the northern bald ibis is Waldrapp, and Johannes Fritz is director of the Waldrappteam. In this role, he has spearheaded a multi-year rewilding project. It plays out pretty much like the movie that inspired him, the movie about Bill Lishman and those Canada geese. A researcher, really a foster parent to the birds, flies in the microlight airplane to demonstrate the migratory route, guiding the learning birds to a safe spot for wintering. The distances traveled to help these bald ibises, as you'll hear, are staggering. Something happened over several recent centuries that wiped out colony after colony of these bald ibises in Europe. Eventually, the only surviving representatives of the species were colonies across the Mediterranean, on the African continent. What and who were the culprits? In part, it had to do with humans wanting and needing something to eat. Ibises were easily come by and tasted good.
People hunted them for food and collected the chicks for food. And it was rather easy because bald ibises were always close to human settlements. And so if you find a colony, you can easily collect the chicks or hunt the birds. The first population actually we know went extinct was the Egyptian population about 5,000 years ago. And about 400 years ago, in the Middle Ages, the European population disappeared. It's probably because of overhunting and collection of chicks.
The Little Ice Age factored in here as well, Fritz says. It was more regional than global, actually. It's long been known that Europe was hit hard between 1500 and 1800. He says these colder conditions likely lowered the reproductive success of the ibises, and additional reasons for bald ibis decline were playing out in Africa and the Middle East. By the 20th century, even though pressure from hunting had abated, human agricultural practices began taking a heavy toll, with the application of pesticides on open farmlands, especially DDT. These chemicals made their way into the guts of birds by way of the worms, the bugs, the larvae that they needed as a mainstay of their diet. Today, there's only one wild colony left anywhere in the world. It's in an isolated area on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. In short, this episode of Constant Wonder is not a happily ever after ibis story, but the dark cloud does at least have a bright silver lining.
Fortunately, in the 1930s, birds were collected from breeding colonies in the Atlas region in Morocco. They were brought to zoos in Switzerland and in Innsbruck, and there they started to breed them. And meanwhile, we have a well-managed zoo population, thousands of individuals with much too much offspring, meanwhile. But this is the basis for research and for conservation.
Endangered wild species do not always thrive in captivity, but the bald ibises brought to zoos in the 1930s did, and apparently none too soon, because they had run out on their luck. From out of this residual pool of ibises held in captivity in the Innsbruck area, when the Waldrappteam began its work in 1997, 10 chicks were sent from over 250 miles away to the Konrad Lorenz Research Station just outside of Vienna. Once those chicks were juveniles and set loose, as we've already heard, they tried to fly away home, to a home they couldn't possibly find because they'd lost the instruction manual. And, of course, they'd never seen the movie. But Johannes Fritz had.
I was in the middle of the PhD. I had no pilot license, no experience with flying, nothing like this.
The concept kept gnawing at him. Discussions with his fellow researchers about what to do continued over the next 3 years. In the year 2000, after he had completed his PhD, it became more and more clear that he would remain hands-on with the bald ibis project and the rewilding effort. Sometimes people are so committed to making a difference for good that they are willing to take risks they'd never imagined. Obtaining a pilot's license wasn't the only leap of faith, though. The Waldrappteam also needed to do something that had never been done before with this particular species: conditioning a batch of chicks to go on a long migration. This involved not only imprinting them with a strong bond to a foster parent, but also habituating them to the sound of a microlight's engine. The microlight is a contraption that may be small, but it can make quite the racket. And habituating birds to the sound began when the baby birds were still in the nest. An authentic recording of engine noise was played for them as often as possible, even during feeding times. Every waking hour of conditioning counts, and so the foster parents had almost no downtime for half a year.
It's a very exceptional commitment. I mean, it's early April when they get the chicks, and from that day on, they stay 7 days a week with the birds till arrival at the wintering site. It's early October when they end this work. And it's exceptional that one of them takes a day off. Sleeping there is not necessary, but they leave them in the evening after the last feeding, about 8, and they stay with the birds again the next morning at about 7.
Johannes Fritz says that it's very rare for a foster parent to take a day off. Every workday begins at about 7 in the morning and ends at about 8 p.m. with the last feeding of the day. I asked what this feeding regimen is like.
It depends on the age of the birds. In earlier phases, as chicks, when we take them out of the nests for hand raising, they need to feed them every half hour, then every hour. If the birds fledge, so about mid of June, they get the food in the morning, lunchtime, and then in the later afternoon. And so it's a protocol, it's a development.
In the wild, bald ibises eat worms and larvae. But in captivity, the foster parents give their chicks a mix of minced beef heart and minced rats and mice, supplemented with calcium and vitamins. The foster parents also play educational games with the chicks, and this prepares them for threats they'll eventually encounter in the wild. It's an intensive process.
They're wild birds, but they fully trust you and stay with you. They allow you to experience every aspect of their life because for them you are part of them. You are a bird for them. You are a parent for them. And this gives you a perspective on animals which you hardly have in any other way. So you have to be ready to get emotionally involved. You have to be ready to build an emotional relationship to each of these individuals during hand raising. Only this allows you to fly with the birds later on, birds which you can lead for hundreds of kilometers.
For all of this labor-intensive business of nurturing and imprinting, one aspect of an ibis's inclination to migrate with you is just hardwired in as a biological instinct. There's no way to time or control it artificially.
It's a migratory species. This means they have adaptations for migration. And there is a period in the year where they are prepared and ready for migration. So birds have to enter into a status of migratory readiness.
Johannes Fritz is director of the Waldrappteam, which has been conducting a long-term nature conservation project, not only to reintroduce and rewild northern bald ibises that have long been extinct in Europe, but to help them establish a sustainable migratory pattern. The team is supported by 8 different organizations in 3 countries of the European Union. I'm Marcus Smith, and you're listening to Constant Wonder. I'd like to introduce you to another show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, The Lisa Show, hosted by comedian, believer, and single mother Lisa Valentine Clark. The Lisa Show delves into most any challenge that meets us in the course of our lives, especially challenges in the realm of human relationships, whether it's parenting, mental health questions, or social issues. Lisa and her council of moms are willing to tackle it. Figuring life out is vexing enough without losing an ability to laugh or cry together or just plain talk things through. The Lisa Show. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. Having raised birds that they hoped would literally follow them anywhere, Johannes Fritz's team had to figure out just where to guide them for overwintering, or where to try to guide them at least. It still wasn't certain if the birds would even cooperate, so the project was essentially a feasibility study. If successful, it could then transition to a fully fledged rewilding effort. One problem, though. Even if the team knew about several historic breeding locations for the northern bald ibis, all knowledge of former migratory routes and destinations had disappeared upon their extinction from Europe. Remember, this had been specialized cultural or social knowledge. It was never a matter of genetic instinct.
This was a kind of a problem on the one side. On the other side, it also gave us a degree of freedom because when you don't know about the wintering site, you can choose it on your own. And that's what we did.
way down south, over the Alps and across Tuscany to the Mediterranean coast, is a well-known wintering area for many species of migratory birds. It's called Laguna di Orbitello. After the team had consulted with ornithologists who knew the area, Laguna di Orbitello was deemed to be a suitable destination for these ibises. In the early stages of the project, the scheme was to use a microlight aircraft that had 2 seats, one for the pilot and a second for the foster parent. But this plan was flawed, because in order to remain airborne, these heavier models of microlight airplanes simply needed to fly faster than the birds could ever keep up with.
All of them were too fast. The way to reduce the speed is to lower weight and to increase the size of the wing. And therefore, we ended up with 1-seated microlights, what means that the pilot and the foster parent has to be the same person. That was me. For 2 years, it was a 1-seated microlight, and I was the foster parent and the pilot, alone with the birds in the air. Then we changed to a new type of microlights, the ones we use now. That's the paraplane with this parachute, this flexible wing. And this allows us to fly perfectly the speed of the birds, double-seated.
In 2007, the team began operating with 2 pilots, taking turns in the front seat, and the back seat is always for a foster parent.
We as pilots don't interact with the birds, we don't communicate with them. All of that is with the foster parent on the back seat.
Well, Johannes, I have to say, this sounds a little bit like a childhood dream come true. I mean, everybody at some point or other imagines being up in the wide open sky, flying with the birds. And is this as magical as I want to believe that it could be, or is it just a little bit more on the scary side of things?
The birds sometimes fly really that close that you can touch them. The pilots don't like it because it's risky, but for the foster parents, it's of course great. And the birds they have greeting behavior. They do that on the ground very regularly, so moving the bill up and downwards and make this greeting sound. They do that actually also during the flight. This is really funny and impressive that when the bird approaches and it recognizes the foster parent during the flight, it greets, stays a little bit with the foster parent, and then leaves again.
Johannes Fritz told me that he has never become completely accustomed to the strangeness of this situation, flying with the birds, even after having made these seasonal trips for 16 consecutive years.
Again and again, every year, to be up there in the sky with the birds, it's unique, it's exceptional. And it's so fascinating for me that these birds can do whatever they want in the air, in 3 dimensions. They can leave in every direction, fly wherever they want. Instead, they stay with you and follow you for hours and for hundreds of kilometers because of this social bond, this imprinting, the social relationship between the birds and the foster parents.
Johannes Fritz says that for most of a migration's duration, which can take over 2 months and stretch for hundreds of kilometers, depending on the destination, the group of ibises and the microlight generally fly parallel to each other, unless an individual happens to come in close to make that greeting sound. To conserve energy, the ibises will also typically assume a V formation to reduce drag.
It's much more efficient and cheaper for them to fly in a formation. That's also what we like them to do, because this allows us to fly for big distances.
Tell me about this other trick they have. It's a flying technique we refer to as riding the thermals, because I guess a pilot has to take this into account too and make adjustments.
The most efficient way to fly for a bird is soaring and gliding. Bird migration is all about efficiency, all about energy saving. And the wing flapping flight needs about 12 times the basic energy requirement of a bird. It's very expensive. Formation flight reduces the costs to about 7 to 8 times the basic metabolic rate. So it's still expensive, but much cheaper than individual flight. And soaring and gliding means about 1.5 to 2 times the basic metabolic rate. It's almost the same energy requirement than doing nothing. So they can do it for hours without exhaustion. And that's what they do.
It's usually later in the morning as the sun hits the ground that a pocket of air somewhere warms up and a thermal starts taking shape. This is when the ibises start looking around for a free ride upward. And after getting to a sufficient altitude, they can then glide a considerable distance horizontally.
They soar up, they glide, they soar up, and they glide. That's very efficient for them. For the pilots, it's a big challenge. Yeah. First, because it slows down. The soaring and gliding is the most efficient way to fly, but it's the slowest way in terms of moving forwards, because there's always this soaring period with no forward movement. And as a pilot, we have in mind it's still 130 kilometers to the destination, and I have this amount of petrol, and there's a weather coming from somewhere, whatever. The birds don't care about that. And you have no choice than doing what they do.
As he explained earlier, the microlights that the team uses currently are not rigid fixed-wing aircraft. Instead, these are powered parachutes. They're usually best suited for use in rather stable aerodynamic conditions, not particularly well designed for the more dramatic alpine thermals.
We learned to cope with these conditions, even learned to think in the way the bald ibises think. This allowed us at the end to make flights up to 300 kilometers, even landing in between, refueling the planes.
Is it the pilot who says, I'm going to catch that thermal and the birds will follow me, or are the birds actually leading the way?
I mean, if you are an observer from the ground, I think it's sometimes unclear who is following whom, because it's indeed that the birds actively approach thermals and they feel them. So even as a professional, it's sometimes frustrating, because these are birds which have almost no flight experience yet in the first year of life, but they are far better than us in finding thermals. It's an instinct. So yes, sometimes we have to follow them and look if we find a thermal which lifts us up, because the birds were already 150 meters above us. So it's a play between birds and pilots.
Throughout migration, apart from what's happening up in the air in this play between birds and pilots, there's also action on the ground the whole time, with a chase team keeping visual contact if possible, or keeping in touch with a pilot by radio. This support crew on the ground is responsible for the transport and deployment of a mobile aviary. This is about 30 feet wide and 40 feet long. It's equipped with nets and an electric fence to keep foxes and other predators out. Apparently, the ibises home in on this aviary without much reluctance at all once they see it.
So on flight days, we don't feed them before the flight. They get first-time food after entering this aviary. So this is very positively associated for the birds. They like to go in there. That's what they know, and they relax there.
If any of this description of human-assisted migration sounds routine, remember, the team has been at it now for more than a decade and a half, and routine functions have come at the cost of a whole lot of trial and error. You get only one shot per year, and then from whatever you've learned, you adjust your playbook for the next year.
We started the first trials in 2001, 2002, and it lasted for 13 years. We did a kind of feasibility study, trial and error. After all these experiences and failures, we were able to apply for funding to start with the real reintroduction. And this was a period of a lot of failures throughout all these years, periods where the birds refused to follow the microlight. We could sometimes even not start the migration because the birds were not willing to follow. This was particularly the case during the early years, also because the microlights were too fast and we always had to circle to keep contact to them. And so they finally lost their motivation, refused to follow and turned back to the site where we started. And so we had a lot of such situations throughout the years, but we never gave up.
Not everyone would overcome these repeated setbacks. 13 years of feasibility studies. That's a rare level of commitment. Johannes Fritz knew he shouldn't feel overly hopeful about what they might achieve in a single season's guided migration, even if everything went well to the designated overwintering site. They would likely need to wait 3 years before having any compelling results. This is because juvenile northern bald ibises stay at their first distant destination for 3 years, generally speaking, until they reach full maturity. Only when they're old enough to reproduce do they migrate back to the starting point, the breeding site. The first ibis to make this critical breakthrough, a female named Goya, did so in 2011. Goya's was a brief but extraordinarily significant life, and we'll hear about her next, here on the Constant Wonder podcast. I'm Marcus Smith. I'd like to take just a brief moment here to introduce you to another gem from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's called In Good Faith. You can immerse yourself in a soul-nourishing experience of spiritual exploration. Stephen Cat Perry is the host, and he features people of diverse religions and spiritualities. He always interviews them with an aim to come upon a genuine understanding of the guest's relationship with the divine. Maybe you're wanting to strengthen your own relationship, or maybe you just feel a hunger for thoughtful conversation that touches on faith and belief. Whatever your need, it's truly rare these days in the media landscape to find conversations that unfailingly nourish and uplift your soul. In Good Faith does that every time, and you'll find it wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. Our guest in this episode is Johannes Fritz. He's director of the Waldrappteam, which is rewilding an endangered migratory species known as the northern bald ibis. The bird that made the big breakthrough in this story of rewilding and the reestablishment of a cycle of migration for this species had actually completed her first southerly migration in 2009 as a juvenile. So it was a bit precocious of her to return to the place she had begun her life after an absence of only 2 years. She was not yet sexually mature, but return she did to her birthplace in Bavaria.
This was Goya, a female bird, which was raised in 2009. It followed the microlight to Tuscany. And in 2011, at the time, we didn't have GPS. So we had site reports in Tuscany, and at a certain time in early spring, the bird disappeared like others, and usually it remained gone.
Gone to lunch, apparently, learning to forage at the wintering site, maybe posing for avid human birders who frequent this well-known nature preserve, the Laguna di Orbitello, perhaps taking a selfie or two, and of course dodging predators, basically getting through bird adolescence.
But in this case, I can remember this very well. It's the key milestone of our project. It was late July 2011. I was in Tyrol, and I got a phone call from a colleague from Burghausen. This is a city in Bavaria where we aimed to establish a first breeding colony. And he told me, Johannes, there is a bald ibis here sitting in the area where we trained the birds. And it has color rings, and he told me the ring colors, and I knew this is Goya. This is Goya, the bird which disappeared in Tuscany. And so it became clear we have a first bird which returned from Tuscany, a first bird which did what we expected them to do. And so I jumped into the car and drove to Burghausen, and it was indeed Goya which was there. Yeah.
Would she have looked at you and said, I know who that is?
Maybe she recognized me, but she was not raised by me. I was not a foster parent, but my colleague Markus Unseld raised her, and he also came there, and Goya recognized him immediately. Oh, this was a great moment for the project.
With her return, Goya had jumped the gun. She was what Johannes Fritz calls a sub-adult bird. He explained to me how this behavior is now known to be not really at all exceptional. Subadults will make their first ever return flight a little too late to catch the normal breeding window for mature adults. So we're talking end of July, which means that the turnaround to head south again comes with a very short layover, almost on the heels of having just arrived. The Goya story isn't over after just 2 years of life and a return trip, though, because she is the bird in this rewilding project who was not only the very first to complete forth and back migration, but also the following breeding season and in her 3rd year of life, the first then to achieve successful reproduction outside of a zoo.
In 2012, it was the first bird which raised 2 chicks in the wild, together with a male bird, of course. And it became then the first bird which left from Burghausen, followed by the 2 juveniles. This means that this migration tradition enters into the 2nd generation. The migration tradition we started up with our microlights. That stage it became clear this could be the method to reintroduce this species into the wild. That was really meaningful. It was a big milestone.
If you want to remember the name of a famous bird in modern times, you would do well to remember Goya. Remember her as the first migratory breeding northern bald ibis in Europe after what is probably a gap of over 400 years. But a fair and full assessment of her remarkable achievement goes far beyond that one statistic alone. So let's take a closer look at everything she pioneered. Her life began just as it does for any other bird inside an egg, confined within a shell to develop in safety. Then, upon hatching, she remained in confinement under the watchful eye of a supervising foster parent. She successfully bonded with that foster parent, learned to trust and rely on that human enough to fly alongside a microlight several hundred miles to Tuscany. She spent 2 years there before returning, of her own accord and completely unsupervised, back to Bavaria. The following year, after a second migratory round trip, she raised 2 chicks with a partner and headed south again for the 3rd time, guiding those 2 juveniles of hers. She was an independent, rewilded creature who could pass on skills of migration to the next generation. Why should any of this really be so mind-boggling? Well, for one obvious thing, no 3-year-old human could ever do this. And for another, a lost natural cycle had been reestablished that could have been sustainable, at least for these 3 birds, barring any human interference. And that's where this pioneering story takes a tragic twist. After having accompanied her 2 offspring down into Tuscany in 2012, having flown most of the way to the overwintering site at the Laguna di Orbitello, Goya and one of the juveniles were shot. This happened in the region of the ancient port city of Livorno. Usually, with a crime like this, a fairly inconspicuous environmental crime, the perpetrator never gets found out. In the case of Goya and her killed juvenile, however, the poacher was identified and eventually sentenced. It's often tempting to think of conservation projects like this in terms of batches and flocks, and multiples of tens, 20s, hundreds. But the individual stories are at the heart of it all. And that's something a poacher is unlikely to appreciate. The long-term aim of Johannes Fritz and the Waldrappteam that he leads is to instigate each year a new wave of migrants, a new batch of hatchlings bred in captivity, renewing this cycle and adding strength in numbers with the hope that they can expand the total ibis count in Europe until such time as the population is large enough to sustain itself.
The population has now reached a number of about 260 to 270 birds. Meanwhile, we have 4 breeding colonies, and also since 2012, birds grow up in the wild and they learn the migration route. Last year, we had more than 70 chicks fledged in the wild, so really a big number. And the Leibniz Institute in Berlin did a study modeling on the basis of demographic data of our project. And they came up with a threshold to self-sustainability. And it needs about 350 birds for a self-sustaining migratory population. And so the population is close to self-sustainability in this sense.
The Waldrappteam has been at the heart of a watershed moment in the story of human-led animal migration, and their conservation efforts with the northern bald ibises have led to one of the very first successes where animals are not only restored in a place where they've gone missing, but where their migratory pattern is also reinstituted as an integral part of this process of rewilding. Of course, it's never been easy for the team, and a story like this can have endless bends and twists, and this one took a major twist, away from Italy towards Spain. Among the unpredictable hurdles that the team confronted was that after initial successes in rewilding and supporting migration, the ibises began departing from Germany too late in the season to make it safely to Tuscany before the onset of cold weather in the Alps. Johannes Fritz and the team knew the danger. Without enough food for the birds in high elevations, they were left with no choice but to recapture ibises and then drive them overland into Italy. At that point, I might have conceded failure for the whole concept and venture. But this team decided to redraw their maps from scratch, establishing a new wintering site in Spain. This new destination would be much further away, but it was also much less daunting terrain to fly over. The Spanish province of Andalusia is on the southern side of the Iberian Peninsula. In 2023, bringing a group of first-time migrants with him, Johannes tested out a brand new flight path, 3 times the distance of the original wintering site in Tuscany. The challenge would be to guide the ibises 1,500 miles, or 2,300 kilometers.
We try to fly as straight as possible, but we also have to avoid restricted areas and so on. In particular, we are not allowed to fly through Switzerland. So the first thing we have to do is go a little bit north into Baden-Württemberg and from there directly to France. And then the journey goes more or less straight southwest. So we reach the Mediterranean Sea just on the border between France and Spain. We follow the coastline till Valencia. And from there we enter onto the countryside and finally end up in Andalusia. That's a journey without significant alpine barriers, so the birds can reach this wintering site also in times of climate change.
42 days in transit with the birds, 3 emergency landings because of strong headwinds that drove them backwards. One of these unplanned landings left them, of all imaginable places, in an olive grove.
It was a fenced area, a small one, and no chance to leave from there again with the planes. No chance for our colleagues with the cars to enter there and give us support and provide water for the birds. So it was a very tricky situation. And then they found the man which owned this area, and they explained him what is the situation. It's not easy to explain this, of course, because it's rather exceptional. The funny thing in this case was that this man, kind old man, the evening before, he heard about this project on TV for the first time in his life. And the next morning, they knock on his door and tell him that exactly this team is now on his entity, close by the fence. And so it was really funny, and he was totally surprised by it, but at the end, very kind. And so we successfully landed there. But after this emergency landing, the next day, we reached the wintering site, and there were hundreds of people there. Children, adults, enthusiastic Spanish people, they're welcoming us. It was a big event. It was a really big welcome organized by our partners from Andalusia. So this was a highlight, a big highlight for us, yeah.
Does it make a huge impression, a huge splash wherever you go with your birds following you?
This is always a big attraction, of course. Usually when we land on new airports, there are many people expecting us, also journalists expecting us to land there. And when we stay at an airfield, people from around come and have a look. It affects the regular traffic at the airfields when we are there, because the birds are not used to bigger planes. People should not be close to the aviary. But people are very tolerant usually and very kind, and they limit the air traffic in the time when we stay, or they even close the airfield for some time just because of us. Yeah. Sometimes we have people which say so much money spent for some birds, but the absolute majority of people are very much in favor of it and see a reason. And I think this is something which motivates us a lot. So there's a lot of excitement and also enthusiasm about the project.
So the 2023 group that your team delivered to Andalusia, around the Alps, into France, down the Mediterranean, that whole route over the coast, over the countryside. If I understand what you've said, this 2023 group is going to hang out there, growing, maturing for a total of 3 years, and then they should be able to find their way back to Bavaria, their birthplace, and all of this independent of human support or guidance.
Yeah, easily. And usually the back migration is done by each single bird. They migrate on their own, not in groups, but each bird on its own. And they land exactly, so 2,300 kilometer journey, and they land exactly on the location where we had our campsite easily.
That's even more remarkable, to think that they would do it alone and not in a group.
Yeah, really.
Of all the miraculous things that we share in episode after episode of Constant Wonder, I think that animal and human sentience and intelligence are often most astounding. And we often push hard here against any temptation we might have to think that intelligence across species is all of one kind. What bumblebees or cuttlefish or ravens can do as sentient creatures, well, it seems infinitely varied, and there is wonder in that variety alone. A northern bald ibis will not impress us by using an external object the way a raven might as a tool. But if you measure these ibises by their navigational skills over vast distances, after a single exposure to the route, without a map, no GPS, not even Google Maps to consult, well, these birds are geniuses. Apparently they do need, however, an attentive, knowledgeable parent or foster parent with some sort of wings to show them the way. Johannes Fritz is founder of the Waldrappteam, which aims to reintroduce the northern bald ibises into Europe. This episode was produced by Tenere Taylor, Eric Schultzke, and Mamie Teeples, with sound design by Josh Fouts. Thanks to you for listening. I'm Marcus Smith. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio.